I embarked on my first scouting expedition into the Wildhorse country west of Copper Basin in May of 2015. Somewhat ironically, my departure on that first scouting trip was delayed by about an hour because I had to help a neighbor catch a wild horse that had gotten loose. Once I arrived in the area, however, I saw no wild horses, nor would I have expected to see any, as the terrain did not provide particularly good habitat for them, much of it being far too steep and densely forested for horses. I spent an hour or so fishing Wildhorse Creek, a swift, clear stream of substantial size and flow that looked as if it would afford promising habitat for trout, but I caught nothing. There is a tributary of Wildhorse Creek called Falls Creek, and a sign near the road spoke of a waterfall on Falls Creek about a mile upstream of the confluence, with a developed foot trail leading to the falls. The developed trail terminated in a wooden platform from which one could observe the falls. The waterfall, however, was really more of a steep cascade, with foaming whitewater plunging 30 or 40 feet at an average angle of about 45 degrees. I decided to explore a little further up the creek, and followed the bank beyond the end of the trail for perhaps a quarter of a mile as it wound through a shallow, rocky canyon in a series of rapids and foaming torrents. Rounding a bend in the creek, I became aware of a dull roaring sound up ahead, and reasoned that there must be a more substantial waterfall up ahead. Yet it was obscured from my view by a sharp bend in the narrow canyon. Surmounting the canyon wall, I found that there was indeed a much more impressive falls where the creek plunged over a cliff into the canyon, with sheer rock walls on both sides, though its situation in the canyon made it difficult to photograph. After returning to my truck, I followed the road a bit further as it degenerated from a dirt road into a rocky jeep trail, and then I was obliged by dwindling daylight to return home and conclude my initial scouting adventure into the area. Nevertheless, my first impression was that the whole region was very scenic. Above the confluence of Wildhorse Creek and Falls Creek, the canyon is mostly wooded, but the snow-clad Hindman Peaks fairly tower over the landscape, in a manner reminiscent of the Grand Tetons, or perhaps the Matterhorn. Further up the drainage, Wildhorse Creek is formed from the confluence of several smaller creeks, 3 of which emanate from the Wildhorse Lakes, which are distributed among 3 separate folds of the mountain range rising to the west. Over the coming years, I was to undertake a series of expeditions to explore these lakes. My first such expedition took place on August 9th, 2015, when I essayed to reach the northernmost of the Wildhorse Lakes. There is no trail to the lake, but I surmised I could follow the outlet creek up to the lake from the point where it flows into Wildhorse Creek proper. Near where I parked, I found a bountiful patch of wild raspberries, which made a tasty appetizer to the adventure. Setting forth on the hike, the first obstacle I had to surmount was Wildhorse Creek itself, a rushing torrent of knee-deep, ice-cold water some 15 or 20 feet wide. Not wanting to saturate my footwear at the start of the hike, I took my shoes and socks off, rolled up my pant legs, and waded the creek barefoot. By the time I got to the other side, my feet and lower legs were chilled to the point of agony. When I pulled my feet out of the water, they were initially a deathly pale white, but swiftly turned bright red upon withdrawal from the stream. I stood on a patch of soft moss at the brink of the creek for a moment until the pain had subsided, and then found a flat rock on which to sit while I resumed my shoes. After forcing my way through dense underbrush for a few hundred yards, I found the outlet I was looking for, a rushing stream about 6 feet wide that came galloping down the eastern slope of the mountain in an unbroken succession of foaming cascades more than a half-mile in length. I followed the creek up the slope, pausing frequently to take pictures of the cascades where they were visible through the trees. Presently, I emerged from the dense forest into a hanging meadow at the base of a talus slope. As I followed the creek through this meadow, I chanced to find several pieces of quartz adorned with impressive crystals. On the other side of the meadow, the creek plunged into a thicket of small fir trees, and the terrain rose steeply. After fighting my way up the thickly firred slope for a short distance, however, I emerged onto the bench where the lake lay. This lake, for such I presumed it to be at the time, turned out to be little more than a glacial puddle, likely not more than 5 or 6 feet deep at its deepest point, and much smaller than it had appeared on the map. I saw no sign of fish in the lake, and given that I could see essentially the whole bottom of the lake at once, I think it is unlikely that any fish there could have escaped my observation. Nevertheless, the place was highly scenic, with a battlement of cliffs behind the lake over which an impressive waterfall tumbled. After eating lunch there, I returned the way I had come, at one point surprising a large mule deer on the lower slopes of the ridge. Upon reaching Wildhorse Creek, this time I left my shoes on and simply charged ahead all the way across the stream. With shoes on, I was able to navigate the creek much faster, and while my boots saturated instantly with cold water, they did much to break up the convective heat transfer, with the result that I suffered no noticeable chills to my feet on the return trip, though my shoes and lower pant legs did get thoroughly soaked. However, after studying several different maps upon my return from this expedition, I realized that the pool I had encountered was not the only lake on that watercourse, and a somewhat larger and deeper lake is situated further up the talus slope behind the pool I had explored. It was not until July of 2018 that I mounted a second expedition up this northern strand of the Wildhorse Lakes, this time accompanied by my wife. At the brink of Wildhorse Creek, at the outset of the adventure, I offered my wife a choice. I could try to carry her across the stream, thus sparing her the hardship of setting foot in the icy water, but with the attendant risk of immersing both of us in it completely should I lose my footing in the swift current. Or we could hold hands and ford it together, keeping each other upright in the process. She opted for the latter, and so together we braved the icy torrent. Based on my previous experience, we both kept our shoes on while fording the creek, though she brought along a dry pair of hiking boots to change into on the far side, and I wore waterproof socks under my boots. Lighter of build than I, my wife found it difficult to stand upright against the force of the current, but we nevertheless reached the far bank without incident. Once again ascending the slope beside the creek's unbroken chain of cascading whitewater, I was struck by how difficult it is to capture such dynamic natural beauty in still photographs. Someday I hope to return to the creek with a video camera in hopes of better illustrating these scenic cascades. But if so, I shall reserve that for a future episode. As before, after ascending the densely forested lower slopes, we emerged into an alpine meadow and came presently to the large pool that I had previously visited. There we ate the lunch that we had packed, and then pressed on up the steep, rocky slope behind the pool, carefully skirting the cliffs over which the prominent waterfall tumbled. After a long and strenuous, but thankfully uneventful climb, we came at last to the upper lake, which was still partially covered with ice and snow. It was indeed larger and deeper than the lower pool, but gave every appearance of being a sterile glacial pond, devoid of fish nonetheless. Having anticipated that we would reach the snow line, we had brought along a small vial of flavoring syrup, and thus treated ourselves to a round of snow cones while we rested at the lake from the exertion of our climb. As afternoon wore on, however, we carefully descended the slopes up which we had climbed, and returned the way we had come. My first expedition to the middle strand of Wildhorse Lakes took place on September 4th, 2015. On the way to the trailhead, I stopped briefly near where I had forded Wildhorse Creek on my expeditions to the northern lakes to pick and eat a few handfuls of wild raspberries. Parking my trusty Ranger at the end of the jeep trail that toiled up the bottom of the Wildhorse Creek drainage, I set off on foot following the creek. Here there was a trail of sorts. Within a few hundred yards, I came to a substantial tributary of the creek, flowing in from the east and cutting across my path, though it was spanned by a large log, the top of which had been hewn flat, and to one side of which a railing had been attached. Crossing the tributary on this primitive bridge, I continued upstream to the place where the tributary from the Middle Lakes flowed into Wildhorse Creek. Here, Wildhorse Creek proper was in a narrow, sheer-walled channel, and I found a fallen tree that spanned the canyon, providing a slightly nerve-wracking but very serviceable natural bridge on which I was able to cross the creek. I made my way up the slope, mostly on a sort of forested crest that fell away steeply on both sides, with the gorge containing the outlet stream on the right hand and another valley on the left. Occasionally I was able to get a view of the cascades in the gorge, but for the most part the gorge was too steep and too thickly wooded for me to see the stream. Presently the terrain leveled out, and I found a chain of small ponds on a sort of bench between the tree line and the talus slopes above. Again, these pools were too small and shallow to offer much habitat for fish. Yet, according to my GPS, the more substantial lake in this chain was located another half-mile and 1,000 vertical feet further up the draw. So, after eating a brief lunch near the pools, I pressed on up the slope. Ascending the steep talus slope behind the ponds, I suddenly became aware of a pain in my right foot. I took my right shoe off and found the ball of my right foot somewhat swollen and rather sensitive to pressure. The nature, extent, and cause of the injury was not readily apparent. However, the swelling pretty much lined up with a place where the inner sole of my well-worn boots had split open, so circumstantial evidence pointed to my dilapidated boots concentrating pressure on the crack as the likely cause of injury. I tried padding my foot and my shoe in various ways with a handkerchief, but this proved wholly ineffective. Having already come 3/4 of the way to the lake, I was loath to turn back, but after about 20 painful steps onward, and not really knowing how badly or in what manner my foot was injured, my desire to reach the lake was overridden by my desire to get back to the truck while I could still walk. Thus, I reluctantly turned around and hobbled back down the talus to the ponds. Limping back to the tree line, I cut a walking stick, and then made my way carefully back down the slope to the truck. My foot continued to hurt any time I put weight on the ball, but I was thankful it didn't seem to get any worse on the way back. By the next morning, the swelling had dissipated, though the ball of my foot had assumed the blue and purple tones typical of a bad bruise. I christened the uncartographed ponds at the base of the talus the Broken Shoe Ponds to memorialize my first attempt on the Middle Wildhorse Lake, and vowed to return when I was able. In time, my foot healed up completely, but it was not until July of the following year that I was able to make another attempt on the Middle Wildhorse Lake, this time accompanied by my father. We hit the road early in the morning on the 9th of July in the year of our Lord 2016, and parked at the end of the jeep trail as I had done before, whereupon we followed the same route upstream to the pools at the base of the talus. We made good time, reaching the lower pools by mid-morning, and thereafter pressing on up the steep talus slope beyond. Soon we found ourselves at the base not of a waterfall, but rather of a natural water slide, where the stream flowed down a steeply angled but relatively smooth rock face. With some difficulty we skirted this rock face and toiled on up the talus, arriving at the upper lake just after noon. The lake was of respectable size and depth, but gave every indication of being sterile, and even in July a significant portion of its surface was still ice-locked. We fished the lake for some time, but to no avail, and eventually retraced our steps back down the mountain, convinced that this lake, too, was devoid of fish. On September 25th, in the year of our Lord 2015, I undertook an expedition to the southernmost of the Wildhorse Lakes, which, according to the map, is both the largest and highest in elevation of all the Wildhorse Lakes, residing at an elevation of about 10,200 feet above sea level. Driving up the Jeep Trail into the Wildhorse country, I noticed that there was already a light dusting of fresh snow on the higher mountain slopes. A forerunner of things to come, no doubt. But the sky was clear, and the temperatures for the moment were pleasant. I parked at the end of the road and set off following the foot trail that continues up the east bank of Wildhorse Creek. I crossed the tributary stream on the flat log bridge as before, but this time I followed Wildhorse Creek further upstream. Hiking up the trail, I was awestruck by the spectacular vistas that opened before me on all sides. Falls and rapids on the creek, majestic mountains rising above forests of pungent fir, ignited by the occasional stand of brilliant golden aspens. After a little more than a mile, I came to a waterfall where the outlet stream of the southernmost Wildhorse Lake tumbles into Wildhorse Creek. I thought the trail might cross the creek and turn west to the lake, but it didn't even fork to follow the outlet, so I left the trail and found a fallen log on which to cross the creek. From thence I ascended the slope, keeping the outlet creek on my right hand to avoid losing my way in the dense forest. Presently, I emerged from the forest onto a shelf of sorts that earlier in the year would have been a lush meadow studded with occasional trees and rocks, though now the grass was mostly brown. At the far end of the shelf was a rampart of solid rock that sloped steeply upwards for perhaps 400 feet. The creek cascaded down through a deep cleft in the rampart, which I attempted to photograph before essaying to ascend the rock. The rampart was not quite vertical. I was able to ascend it on the left bank of the creek by means of a series of ledges that ran together almost like intentional switchbacks, albeit with a few breaks that required a bit of rock climbing in between. However, it was steep enough that a misstep could mean falling all the way back down with only a few bounces in between. I've never fancied myself much of a rock climber, and so the ascent was a bit nerve-wracking, though there was enough footing that the actual chances of a bad fall were fairly remote. I stopped about halfway up the rampart on one of the wider ledges to eat some lunch. As I was eating, I heard the clatter of a rock tumbling down the slope somewhere off to my right. And when I turned my head to look in that direction, I beheld a shaggy white mountain goat making its way along the rocky slope perhaps 200 yards away. This was the first time I had actually seen a mountain goat in the wilds, and I marveled at the way it moved along the nearly vertical slope. It was by far the most lithe ruminant I have ever seen. Its motions seemed more cat-like than goat-like. I tried to photograph it, but at that distance it showed up as little more than a small white blotch in the picture. After surmounting the rampart, I followed the stream up a rocky slope that was, in most places, quite steep, but seemed rather mild after what I had just climbed. I was above the tree line, so there was nothing to inhibit my view of the veritable gallery of waterfalls and cascades by means of which the creek descended the mountain. At length I arrived at the lake, the shore of which was located quite literally at the snow line, though the air seemed surprisingly warm considering that the snow did not appear to be melting. The blue-green water appeared to be very deep, and this, combined with the good inflow and outflow, made me think that the lake would probably support a fish population. However, after fishing it for the better part of an hour, I saw no evidence of fish actually living in the lake. As I was fishing, a fierce wind came up, and by this time it was already mid-afternoon, so I returned the way I had come, save that when I came to the rampart I took a roundabout route that looped far to the north, but enabled me to avoid most of the steepest part, reducing the part that felt like rock climbing from about 400 vertical feet to about 40. Thus it was that I arrived back at the trailhead with still better than an hour of daylight remaining, and returned home without incident. Though my expeditions revealed a general dearth of fishing possibilities in the Wildhorse Lakes, this region nevertheless captures the imagination and refreshes the soul with the splendor of its untamed beauty.